We are calling this as somewhat of a mini-series within the Chapter 14 series, and that is choosing to become a disciple. And here we're only looking at 3 verses, but within these 3 verses, there is a lot of information that needs to be covered that will open avenues of insight that will bring it to life within a first century setting. It adds context to the words that you wouldn't see otherwise. And that's one of the things we want to do as much as possible. The verses we're looking at from the King James Version, Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 27. And there went great multitudes with him. And he turned and said unto them, If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. There's no parable here yet, but it's the pretext to the parable, and as such becomes very important to understand what's going on. There's some points to ponder. Where are they going? They're going to Jerusalem. Why are they going? And don't say because their rear ends are sore from sitting so long. They're going to Jerusalem. You would know it as the Last Supper. But they're not going to Jerusalem to have the Last Supper. They're going to celebrate what? Passover, a.k.a. Pesach. Who knows what is about to happen? Only Yeshua. Only Yeshua knows that the end is near. What does everyone else think? They've been with Yeshua for a while. They've been with him through this entire chapter. That's the group who's getting up and going, gang. Yes, this starts a new segment, but this new segment, which is based on everything that we covered before in Luke 14, now we're on our way to Jerusalem. We're going to have Passover, and on our way, Yeshua, who we've realized if we were in this group that he's the Messiah. So what are we thinking? We're thinking the Messianic kingdom is coming. Here is Messiah ben David. He is going to lead us in this glorious, glorious conquest of Israel. Our enemies will be at our feet. We will no longer be in subjection to them. We will be in control. The Messiah will lead. Israel will be glorious once again. The temple will be in full bloom. We will not have overlords, even putting new high priests in. God himself will be putting the high priests in. They're real excited. But that's not really what's going to happen, is it? What's going to happen is going to confound a lot of people. That's why I put, what does the multitude thinks about to happen? Who is the multitude, and what is the significance? Well, we covered these questions. They're the group that was there that got up and left with him. Did everybody go? We don't know. I'm sure you did have some Pharisees go, and I'm sure you had some who says, no, we're staying here. So these are some things to think about as we go forward. And that's why we wanted to talk about some of those. But with some of the things that Yeshua's going to say, can you imagine having some problems? Got to hate mom, hate dad, hate sister, hate Mr. Rogers. No, I didn't say that. You've got to hate family. You got to hate your own life. There's a lot of hate going on. Wow. But if you don't do this, you can't be his disciple. We need to see what's going on. We need to see the significance of what he's saying, as well as he talks about bearing the cross. Do they know Yeshua's about to die? Do they know he's going to Jerusalem to be crucified? See, because we read this stuff in, but they don't know that at this point. Yeshua hasn't let on. Yeshua lets on quite a bit during that so-called Last Supper, which is actually a Passover Seder. He lets on quite a bit there. So let's move forward. The first two verses want to cover together. And there went great multitudes with him, and he turned and said unto them, If any man come to me, and hate not his father, and mother, and wife, and children, and brethren, and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. That's a very, very harsh statement. So the first thing we notice is the phrase, and he turned. This is the second aorist passive participle of strepho, a common verb. It is a dramatic act on the part of Yeshua. A deliberate, this is important, a deliberate effort to check the wild and unthinking enthusiasm of the crowds who followed just to be following. Right? They're excited. They think this is Messiah ben David. There's a pretty rambunctious crowd, right? So when he turns, he's got some stuff to say. He's got to set the record straight. Things aren't always what they seem. And it talks about disciple. We've got ideas what disciples are. We've all been taught different things on disciples. It comes from a root word meaning to learn. When we're born again, we're supposed to be disciples, aren't we? No, I'm just born again. That's good enough for me. Well, when you're born again, did you know everything? Did you understand what you really signed on for? No. And many churches never told you what you really signed on for, did they?
Most of them don't read the Bible enough.
And if Jesus is Lord and Savior, his kingdom functions a little bit different than this one. You best be in the situation of a learner. A disciple, therefore, is a learner, but the word connotes more than the idea of a student-teacher relationship. A disciple is one who follows the lifestyle, habits, and way of thinking of his teacher or master. The goal of a disciple is to become as much like the teacher as possible. This is interesting. Discipleship was common in the ancient world, roughly equivalent to our practice of apprenticeship. I thought that was a very, very good way of putting it, because in an apprentice, you're not quite where the master skillman is, but you're learning, right? You're learning to become that master skillman, and as serving as an apprentice, you're learning. What does that also mean? It's hands-on, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You're doing the work. You're watching it done, and then you're doing it. And you're doing it until you're at the level of the skillman. Right? Whatever that trade may be. In a religious context, a disciple was a pupil who attached himself to a teacher or a rabbi. Now, gang, the position of, might you call someone rabbi or rabbi in the first century? Mm-hmm. To connote them as a teacher. Someone who is a teacher, someone who is learned and who is imparting wisdom, that would be an honorific thing to say. Or you could say that would be a compliment. Right. But to acknowledge him in the position hadn't existed yet. So keep that in mind. To acquire his religious knowledge and skill, he went through a process of training and testing. But his ultimate loyalty was not to his rabbi, right? Because what if you get someone who teaches so different? Now, if you taught way, way off the mark in the first century, do you know what another group of scholars or another group of sages would say about you? They would say you destroyed the Torah. That was a phrase. Does that sound familiar? That was a phrase to say that your interpretation was so far off that you literally destroyed the Torah. Now, if you gave an interpretation that was not only correct, but it offered insight, it made the scriptures clearer than they've ever been heard, they would say you fulfilled the Torah. Which one of those you think Yeshua did? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he's doing that when he's 8 years old, isn't he? So it's the kind of thing that it adds meaning, but the loyalty is to Torah. So if that's the case, what must Yeshua be teaching? If he teaches anything other than Torah, nobody's going to listen to him. Nobody's going to follow him. Because the Torah and tradition stood above the rabbi or the sage, a disciple would join himself to a teacher of his own choosing. Much as a modern student makes the choice of a university, the disciple's real attachment was to the law and to a way of life. This is a God-centric way of life. This is choosing to put God at the center. First place, we could say the only place, and everything else conforms to that. I'm sort of setting you up for something here. Despite the many hardships, there was nothing to compare with the exhilaration of following and learning from a great teacher. There's a reason I didn't use the word there. And disciple, in which the teacher became like the father. In fact, he was more than a father, and was to be honored above the disciple's own father, as this passage from the Mishnah indicates, from Mishnah Bava Metzia 2:11. If it seems shocking that someone would ransom his teacher before his own father, it is only because we do not understand the tremendous love and respect that disciples and the community at large had for the rabbis or the teachers. Disciples were often referred to as rabbis' sons. A tradition from the time of Elijah. The ancient prophets of Israel, like Elijah and Elisha, traveled with bands of followers called the sons of the prophet. So this isn't something brand new, is it? As you find out, the longer you'll study and try and put things back in a first century perspective, there's nothing new in the New Testament. We're supposed to hate. That just flies in the face of Torah, doesn't it? Torah doesn't teach you to hate. I mean, at points God says to love what he loves and hate what he hates. But that isn't mother, father, brother, sister, yourself. So it must mean something else. Hate could function as it's hyperbole. A Semitic way of saying love less. But this point hardly diminishes the offensiveness of this saying in a society where honor of parents was considered virtually the highest obligation, and one's family was usually one's greatest joy. Do we see that in Torah? You better believe it. It's in the 10 suggestions. 10 commandments, isn't it? I say that because too often we treat them like suggestions. Teachers regularly demanded great respect and affection, but in Jewish tradition, only God openly demanded wholesale devotion, as Yeshua claims here. Does that look familiar? Yeah, it's part of the Shema. To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In Semitic terms, to hate means to love less than someone or something else. You could say that your love for that something else or that someone else is so much greater than the thing you're comparing it to, that the only way to show just how great that difference is to describe one as loved and one as hated. It doesn't mean you hate the one. It just means the thing you love so much more, right? It means that it has what? First place. First place. It means that someone or something does not receive priority but is relegated to second or third place. That's the thing you love less, or in the Semitic way of saying, hate. Whoever does not say Jesus is first and foremost in my life cannot be Yeshua's disciple. That makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
He should be first. The confusion is due to Yeshua's use of a Semitic idiom to love one person more than another is described in the Old Testament language as loving one and hating another. Think of Jacob's wives. One is described as loved, one is described as hated. Think of a couple boys, couple brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Esau's hated, Jacob's loved. They're not actually hated, but there's a difference in the degree to which they're loved. Matthew records Yeshua as saying, "He that loveth father," and this is so much clearer to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
He says, Matthew records, and he says, Yeshua says, "He that loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." This is in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. And this shows that hate is to be taken in a comparative sense. Now here's the thing. We think of family in our own culture. I want you to look at family in a first century Jewish culture. Think about this. There is no word in Hebrew or Greek that precisely corresponds to the English word family. In both languages, the closest word could be translated house or household. Bayet in Hebrew, or oikos or orkia in Greek. The same word can be used for the building or for the people who live in it. The term focuses on the what? Household as a social and economic unit. So you're scratching your head a little bit trying to make sense of that. Let's move forward and things will become a lot clearer. The ancient Hebrew family included husband, wife, children, and if their sons were married, their wives and children. The husband's parents, the husband's brothers, and their families, the husband's unmarried sisters, and other relatives. It might also include multiple wives and concubines, with their children and their children's family. That's almost like a tribe, isn't it? That's a group, isn't it?
Right.
It's its own little society, if you will. Besides those related by blood or marriage, the household would include servants and slaves, and in many Hebrew, difference between the slaves of the Romans and the slaves of the Hebrews, the slaves of the Hebrews were treated like family. Guests who were bound to the family by obligation of hospitality, and sojourners, alien residents in the household and under its ongoing protection, often employees of the household. That's a large group. That is a what? That's a small community, isn't it?
Right.
Are you starting to see a communal identity? See, because in the West, we don't have the communal identity as much, do we? We see more things through the eyes of the individual. If I make a mistake, it reflects bad on me. Or if I do well, it's because of something I did.
Right.
But in the ancient Mediterranean, if you did bad, it reflected bad on your entire family. It brought shame upon your family's name. If someone in your family did good, it worked the other way. You were part of that community. It was more about a communal identity as opposed to an individual identity. This becomes important as we move forward. For ancient Mediterranean people, personal, that's funny, and I just about did this slide not looking at it. For ancient Mediterranean people, personal identity was not primarily individual, as it is in modern American culture. It's what we just talked about. Instead, people derive their identity primarily from being members of particular groups, such as tribes, clans, and families. In this cultural context, the family had an importance that would be difficult for modern Americans to imagine. Now, Yeshua is telling you put me above this? What if they don't believe Yeshua is the Messiah? What if they believe he's a charlatan? Your entire identity was based on this sub-community, right? That's a very, very difficult decision to make, isn't it? Because now you're an outcast. Not just from family like we have family. And I'm not saying that wouldn't hurt. But you just lost your entire identity. Who you were, what you thought, where you went for support, where your career probably was going to be, where your inheritance was going to be, what the rest of the community might think of you. You can't just hop in the car and go. This is a different world. If this micro community doesn't feel the same way about God that you do, you're in a really rough spot. That's a hard decision to make. Or if they don't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah and you do, that could also be a very hard decision to make. The Old Testament affirms the biological family, which is assumed to be the basic unit of society. Israelite society was structured along kinship lines. Much of Old Testament law regulates and protects family life. But more than this basic affirmation and pragmatic regulation, the family is regarded as a source of divine blessing. This perspective begins in Genesis, or Bereshit, when God creates and blesses the first family and gives them command to do what? Be fruitful and multiply. Children are a blessing from the Lord. The gift of children to barren women is a particular blessing, since God contravenes nature to show his grace. Old Testament faith had a strong corporate dimension. People did not participate in the covenant as isolated individuals, but as members of families, clans, and tribes. Religious commitments made by the head of the household involved the whole family. For example, Joshua spoke for his whole family when he said that he and his house would serve the Lord. In early Old Testament times, the family was the center of worship. See, God was at the center. That's the way it's supposed to be. But here's the problem. In the first century, you don't have any rigid guidelines by what should be taught, how it should be interpreted, right? Mm-hmm. So, as people look back, and even through when we get into our rabbinic Judaism, when we get into our Talmuds, we find statements to the effect of that different rabbis in their interpretation, or different sages in their interpretations of Torah, are seen as what? Different Torahs. Matter of fact, it's also believed that when the Messiah came, that he would teach Torah in such a way, it would be so revolutionary. It was referred to as New Torah, because it would be unlike, it would not be a new Torah, because otherwise he can't be the Messiah, right. But it would be so revolutionary. It would be so filled with wisdom. It would be so clear, so precise, that it would be as if it were a new Torah. So if you get all these different sages in a room, and they're all spouting different interpretations and different halakha, it's as if they've got their own Torahs. They're preaching their own Torahs. What if you got a couple of those within a family? You're going to have some issues, aren't you? Absolutely. The father, as head of the household, was priest for the household. Later, the center of worship shifted to the tabernacle and the temple, and an official priesthood was established even after the temple was built. However, families continued to observe Passover, perform circumcisions, marriages, and funerals, observe the dietary laws, and engage in religious institution. Teaching the law to one's children was one of the obligations of the covenant. You didn't ship them off somewhere, did you? That was a family thing. That was a community thing. First century Mediterranean persons were extremely group-oriented. They learned that a meaningful human existence required total reliance on the group in which one found oneself embedded. This primarily meant the kin group, the village group, the neighborhood, and or the factions one might join. In various ways, these groups provided a person with a sense of self, with a conscience, with a sense of awareness supported by others. See, in the first century, they just didn't stick their kids in front of the computer or the TV and says, okay, I'm going to go do my thing. Or just say it's the school's job to do this or the school's job to do that. That was all the home. That was that little mini community. Such first century Mediterranean persons always needed others to know who they were and to support or hinder their choices of behavior. Can you imagine if choosing Yeshua first puts you outside of this? That's a very, very difficult decision. It's the right decision, but it's difficult. The group, in other words, was an external conscience. Hate one's own life. First, one must deny oneself, totally disavow his own interests. Now, too many things that I read that says, oh, you got to sell everything you own, is calling you to a life of poverty. No, everything you have is a means by which you are capable of serving the Lord in one way or another. They are resources. Matter of fact, in the Shema, don't we say that we will love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our might, and with all our resources? Absolutely. Our allness. In other words, say no to oneself and one's ego as the ultimate norm and goal of one's life. Purposely intensifying the negative idea of this first means Yeshua adds the shocking and repulsive image of a condemned naked criminal being forced to take up the horizontal beam of his own cross and carry it to the place of execution where the upright beam was permanently fixed. Because too many people think it was just that whole crucifix. He's just carrying the center beam and being raised up by that. I mean, that's not a small thing, especially when you're flogged beforehand. But I understand to a degree what he's saying here, and the whole idea of crucifixion, but nobody knows Yeshua is about to be crucified. Yeshua knows. But I want to put a different angle on this where you might think of this differently. And what I believe that was being taught. No more horrific and disgusting symbol of having to bid farewell to one's life, including one's property and means of support, to one's whole past with all of one's family ties, and to one's whole future with all its plans and projects could be imagined by a first century Palestinian Jew. It's not that I don't agree with this, because I do, but I believe he's missing something. Who was all too familiar with this type of execution. The complete loss of control over one's life, indeed over one's bodily functions in public, was made all the more terrifying by the shame and mockery that accompanied this slow and painful death. This culture was very much an honor and shame culture. You didn't just bring that shame to yourself. It was to your family, to that group. You've seen how big that group could be. It could even be to your city, to your community. But that is to give first century Christians a monopoly on an instrument of torture and death that was all too freely bestowed on non-Roman inhabitants. If you were Roman, you weren't guaranteed that this wasn't going to happen. But most of the time when it happened to Romans, it was because of high treason. Of the outlying provinces of the empire, before and after Yeshua, Palestine was studded with crosses, some put up by native rulers in addition to those planted by Roman overlords. As a matter of fact, Yeshua was not the only first century teacher in the Roman Empire to use a cross as a graphic symbol of the suffering that is sure to befall upright persons without any provocation on their part. In his diatribes, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, I'm sure that, yikes, remarks to his students, if you wish to be crucified, wait and the cross will come. In the Greco-Roman world, part of the humiliation of being crucified was that it was all too common a punishment for marginal people, slaves, robbers, rebels, and subject people in general when they disturbed the peace. See, because they would see themselves as above that. So to be identified, that would lower things in their estimation. That's a side point. Doesn't really help us in our teaching here. Hence, it would naturally come to the mind of such socially marginal people as Yeshua and Epictetus, oh boy, that's easy for others to say, as a gripping and all too realistic symbol of suffering and death. As we have seen in Mark 8:34, Parr coheres perfectly with Yeshua's penchant for graphic, shocking language that imprint itself on his disciples' minds. Okay, now I want to look at the part where it says, cannot be my disciple. We really need to break this down, and I kept looking at that. I already understood what, Yeshua meant by hate father, hate mother, hate brother, hate sister, hate wife, hate your own life, But that whole cannot be my disciple. It just, something didn't sit right, but nobody was talking about it. So I looked. It's G1410. It's dunamahi. It says of uncertain affinity. To be able, or is it possible to be the disciple? So you could say he's not able to be my disciple, or it's not possible to be my disciple. Something bothered me about that. You see some of the other words that it could be. The sense of the word, to be or become sufficient to meet a need or a task. I'm no closer than when I started, am I? So I had to go a little deeper. Unable physically. Luke uses this word in the following scriptures. In Luke 1:19-20, and the angel answering said unto him, I am Gabriel, that stand in the presence of God, and am sent to speak unto thee, and to show thee these glad things. And behold, thou shalt be dumb, and not be able to speak. Here it's the word able. So it's not possible for him to speak. Or it's physically impossible for him to speak. Yeah, I agree with that. In Luke 3:7-8, then he said to the multitude that came forth to be baptized of him, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits worthy of repentance, and begin not to say within yourself, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you, and there's a wonderful, wonderful wordplay here, but I'm not going to get into it, that God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. So yeah, the fact that God is able to do that, no doubt. What's this one here? In Luke 12:22-26. And he said to his taught ones, disciples, or Talmudim, for this reason I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you shall eat, nor about the body, what you should put on. The life is more than the food, and the body is more than the clothing. Look at the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor granary, and Elohim feeds them. So God takes care of them, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. They don't have to worry about it. He says, how much more valuable are you than the birds? And which of you worrying is able to add 1 cubit to his life or span? If you then are unable to do the least, why do you worry about the rest? So that actually deals with able, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Okay. In this sense, it has the not possible connotation. In Luke 16:26, all these are the same word. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from thence. There again, it's the same thing. It is not possible. Okay. So let's look at this word a little bit closer. It's from this grouping. Words of this stem all have the basic sense of ability or capability. Dynamai means to be able in a general sense, to be able with reference to the what? Attitude that makes one able, hence sometimes to will. Well, now that's interesting. Can you think of some scriptures where somebody may have said, I cannot, but yet it wasn't really that they couldn't, it's that they wouldn't. Let's just see if that plays out. Think we can find any of those in Luke with the same word?
Mm-hmm.
Here we go, a little bit deeper. And this is from the Enhanced Strong. Talks about it to be able, to be able to have power, whether by virtue of one's ability and resource, or a what? State of mind. See, because that's where I'm taking this. Because if you're not willing to put Yeshua first, you're not in a state of mind to be his disciple because you haven't put him first. It's not that it's not possible. Why can I say that? Because anybody can repent. And when they repent, the wickedness that they were walking in, forgiven, right? Mm-hmm. But what happens to the righteous when they fall into sin? His righteousness is no longer counted. Right. Ezekiel talked about that. That's why that gave me such hard problems. But if it's a state of mind, well, I don't know. Let's just see if we can find some scriptures where that's the case. Luke 14:20. And he from within shall answer, say, trouble me not. Oh, let's go to Luke 11:7. Yeah, I jumped the gun here. And he from within shall say, now what's happened here? This is the friend at midnight. Remember that? Mm-hmm. Trouble me not. The door is now shut. See, because he doesn't have the combination to open the door, he can't possibly open it. No? And my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give thee. Really? He's physically unable. No, he chooses not to, right? Oh, this is better. This is better. And another said, I've married a wife. Remember we covered this. I cannot come. What, has she got you tied up? She got you locked in the closet? Are you drugged? Is that the first thing that happens? You get married, the wife drugs you and says, oh, nope, you're staying here. He can come, can he? Matter of fact, he could bring his wife. So what's he actually saying? I choose not to. Here it is again. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife, children, brethren, and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. It's not that he's unable. He's not of the right mindset to where he's going to. Why? Because he doesn't put God first. If you can't put God first, you are not of a mindset that can be discipled. This is what I'm getting at, and that's what Yeshua says. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. We'll get into that a little bit later. 14:33. So likewise, whoever be of you that forsaketh not all that he has cannot be my disciple. That doesn't mean to get rid of everything you have. If God tells you to do it and you know it's God, you do it. Right. But it's putting him first and realizing that your allness is what you use to serve God, to carry out what he's called you to do. In 16:13, no servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot, same word, serve God and mammon. Because one of them demands to be first, doesn't it? And God doesn't share his glory with anybody, does he? No. What do we do when we keep pagan festivals? We make God share his glory with the pagan deity that festival represents. God doesn't do that. Okay. The word Luke didn't use here. Now this is interesting. because this is later on in our chapter in verses 29 to 30. Lest haply after he hath laid the foundation, and is not able to finish it, all that behold it began to mock him, saying, This man began to build and was not able. This is a different word. Let's see what this word is. It's G2480. Iskuo. I'm going with it. To have deals with force. To be able, to avail, can do, might prevail. The sense is to be or become sufficient to meet a task or a need. We're going to have to go a little deeper, aren't we? That looks strikingly familiar. So let's see if we can't find the difference. Because if there was no difference, Luke should have been consistent, not use two different words. So what you've got is the word. This word group has the meaning to be able, to be capable, the capacity, to have the power or the strength to do it. It is largely coextensive with another word that I can't pronounce. It deals with the actual power to do it, or the capacity, or the capability. That's it. Doesn't deal with a state of mind. Like if you place, maybe if I'm laying on a weight bench, and you put 100 pounds on that, I'll be able to bench press that. You say, hey, that's pretty good. I'm going to put 800 on there. Not a chance. Not a chance. I'll blow, veins and everything else long before I'll get that 800 pounds lifted off that bench. So the 100 pounds, I'd be able to. The 800 pounds, that's where this word comes in. I would not have the strength. I would not be capable of doing it. And no, I do not know what I could bench press. It's nothing I've tried since I was a teenager. Disciple. The Mishnah also illustrates the sacrifice required to be a disciple. The rabbis reasoned that although a man's father brings him into the world, his teacher who instructs him in God's wisdom from the Torah brings him into the world to come. And that is interesting, because we physically exist in this world, don't we? Mm-hmm. But we know there's a world to come. We know there's a world that is eternal. We are literally, I know Paul talks about it, where it's like we've got dual citizenship, doesn't it?
Right.
We've got citizenship in heaven. We've got a citizenship down here. We can see which one, but even there, don't we have to choose which world means more to us? Don't we have to make a choice? And doesn't that choice also reflect who we're putting first? Because in one of those worlds, we're putting ourselves first. In the other world, we're putting God first. Discipleship is about the choice to put God first. That is the first and foremost rule of discipleship. If you can't get that one down, the rest is just playing house, gang. It ain't real. You got to be able to get that one first. So the rabbis reason that although a man's father brings him into the world, his teacher who instructs him in God's wisdom from Torah brings him into the world to come. Therefore, the ties between a teacher and a student assume precedence over the ties between a father and son. The language of the period also reflects these values. Disciples were called banim, sons or children. For example, Yeshua refers to the disciples of the Pharisees as children in Luke 11:19. He also warns that a person cannot be his disciple without first hating his or her parents, spouse, children, or siblings. We talked about that. It's not an actual physical hate. The manner in which hating is used in this verb represents a Hebrew idiom that does not mean literally to hate, but employs comparative language. We talked about that. Disciples are to be so committed to learning from their masters that love of parents is like hatred. It's not that you hate your parents. It's just that you love God so much more that to literally show the distance between the two, you have to use the opposite. In the Matthean parallel in Matthew 10:37, we talked about that. The evangelist renders the idiom more dynamically as love less. The saying of Yeshua shares the same hierarchy of values as the Mishnaic passage. Family relationships take a secondary role to the relationship between a teacher and his disciple. In rabbinic literature, the disciple is obligated to honor his master teacher above his own father, even though the Ten Commandments teach honor of parents. Perhaps considered dysfunctional by 21st century standards, this sort of thinking prevailed in Yeshua's day. To become a disciple of a respected teacher represented a great honor, so the family and community rallied to help a young man realize his aspiration. The master-disciple model was extremely effective in late Second Temple and early Rabbinic Judaism. The word for disciple in Hebrew is Talmid, plural, Talmidim. It really means learner, one who's open to change. Boy, there's a fun word, huh? And is actively seeking how to live life to its fullest potential in the kingdom of heaven. In rabbinic literature, we often see the phrase Talmid Chacham, referring to a student or learner of the sage. Chacham, in the Gospels, the Hebrew Talmid is the equivalent of the Greek Metathetes. The base of this ancient Greek word can be seen in English word mathematics. To translate mathematis into Latin, Jerome used discipulus. In Latin, disco means to study, and from this root word comes our English word disciple. Please forgive my butchering of these words, as my language skills need work. When we read the word disciple in the synoptic tradition, found in the first three Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, we are dealing with the ancient world of late Second Temple period Judaism. And in that world, Talmidim clung to the teacher, whom they called Rabbi, my master teacher of great learning. The sage was known as one who could answer a question in any area because he had complete knowledge of the Bible as well as oral Torah. Gang, I know there's somebody out there you're thinking, oh, we don't need that oral Torah. I don't care if you're Messianic or if you're not Messianic. If you have an idea or you teach what a scripture means or how a scripture is to be carried out, you have an oral Torah. Be very careful what you criticize. The disciple was known as one who could answer any question relating to his specific area of study in the oral tradition. A disciple is an individual who, when asked a question of religious law related to his students, is able to answer it. So while the sage had achieved a mastery understanding of all aspects of Jewish teaching, the disciple could interact with questions connected to his research. The disciple is willing to endure hardship for his learning experience. Yeshua's disciples speak about their commitment. They leave families and businesses in order to follow Yeshua. So if they're leaving, security. Their business would be security. Their family would be their security, not to mention their identity. Mm-hmm. How important must this traveling sage be? Very important. In rabbinic literature, the disciples of the sages neglect their businesses and sacrifice much to acquire Torah learning. See, this is something that in a lot of the churches today, we don't value the Word of God to this degree, right? We don't say, well, no matter what, I'm going to teach Torah. I'm going to find a way to teach. I'm going to find a way to learn. Oh, it's not convenient. This came up. That came up. To one degree or another, we all do it. But it's something to really help put things in perspective. This disciple is expected to serve his master teacher in caring for personal needs. By serving the master, the disciple learns how to conduct his affairs in everyday life situations. He listens to his master's teaching while doing menial chores to assist his mentor. See, because the model even before it was Judaism, was you did to the best of your ability, try and provide the guy you thought had the ability from God to teach. So he had the ability and the time to study because that word meant so much for you. So for you preachers listening, it wasn't so you could go out and buy a jet or, build a new building or start a television ministry or any of this other stuff. It was to get back into the Word. If you teach people, see, we worry so much about, like, we're the only preachers and teachers that God has. So it all has to come through our ministry. It doesn't. The Ruach HaKodesh works as the Ruach HaKodesh works. And is allowed to work. That's why we've always said we teach people to teach people. It spreads so much better that way. Because the disciple should have broad knowledge, he would usually study with one rabbi for a number of years, and then go study under another sage. We don't even have that kind of patience these days, do we? The master teacher was a mentor whose purpose was to raise up disciples who would not only memorize his teaching, but also live out the teachings in practical ways. Isn't that what I just got done saying? Teach people to teach people. The Halakha describes how a disciple walks, as we have seen. Torah learning is evidence in behavior in a rich spiritual life. The disciple walks with God by living out in practice the teaching of his rabbi. Oh, gang. Nearly everything I read talks about how Yeshua was trying to tell him he was going to be crucified. And it's like, well, I'm going to be crucified. You can expect to be crucified too. That's not what would have come to their mind. They didn't know. They thought they were following him into the Messianic kingdom. They thought the glorious days were coming. So let's look at this a little bit. First, come after me. This is Opiso. And it is in the sense of a direction in from being behind something. But it's the idea you're behind something because you're following it. In other words, if it's leading and you're following, whatever you're following knows the way, doesn't it? That's why you're following, because if you knew the way, you'd be leading. So the sense of it is to follow a leader, to accept and follow the leadership, command, and guidance of. Usually literally walking and following were involved as well. So this is following after Yeshua. This is deciding to be, making that commitment to be a disciple. That's what we're talking about here. The second difficult qualification Yeshua stressed was that one must carry his own cross and follow Yeshua. When the Roman Empire crucified a criminal or captive, the victim was often forced to carry his cross as part of the way to the crucifixion site. And Rome was good about making things a public spectacle, weren't they? That was entertainment. You would have seen it somewhere down the line. Carrying his cross through the heart of the city was supposed to be a tacit admission that the Roman Empire was correct in the sentence of death imposed upon him, an admission that Rome was right and he was wrong. Think about this. Rome is a picture of the world, right? And the world's way of doing things. Or, even at this point, a picture of the adversary, much like Pharaoh was. So what would it be? The world is right and God is wrong. What is Yeshua saying? When you decide to follow God, and I mean, we're talking about all in. You decide to follow God all in this time, you were going to make some enemies, weren't you? So when Yeshua says, be prepared to carry your cross, or that cross beam, he's saying you're going to make some enemies. In this world, you're going to make some enemies. There's going to be people who don't like it. And because you're going to make some enemies, it's highly possible you could suffer in this world. That's what he's saying. Doesn't Peter, in one of his letters, talk about after your conversion how your friends find it strange that you don't run with them anymore? It's the same concept, but to a much lesser degree. Crucifixion would have been a graphic image of self-denial at the time of Yeshua. It was designed to be a public deterrent. You follow us, or this will happen. You'd be scared, wouldn't you? If it wasn't scary enough that you had to put God first, when your family may have a completely different, your support base may have a completely different idea of who God is, or what God's actually saying, that puts you out without identity. But here, outside of family, in your everyday life, outside of this community, in front of these Roman overlords, your life lived unto God may anger these people.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say that's even scarier. This was a serious dedication. This wasn't all in. It wasn't guaranteed that it would happen. But you had to know. Wasn't everybody going to love you? Wasn't everybody going to think you're great? Because too many times when we come to faith, we just think, oh yeah, and everybody's, this is going to be great. Everyone's going to love me. All my friends are going to get converted. They're all going to be born again. No, they want nothing to do with you. That happens. That's part of following God. Those in the dark, man, if they've been in the dark for a long time, sit in a dark room, completely dark room for about 2 hours, and then have somebody come on and turn on the light. That's hard on the eyes. That's what happens. Darkness is what they're familiar with. The world knows darkness. They don't know light. You represent that light. People are going to react because some people like their darkness, don't they? Rome liked its darkness. So personally, it humiliated the Jewish victim because of nudity. But even more, all the members of the family were publicly shamed by the incident. Those so put to death were refused a normal burial, which was an insult both to the one crucified and to the family. Rome had power, and it wanted you to know, by force, that you should yield to it.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, however, a social context need to be kept before us. Think of Pharaoh. Who is God that I should worship him? Is that a whole lot different than Rome? See, Rome, you can have your own gods. That's fine. Just don't mess with theirs. Just don't tell them that their gods aren't real. Just don't tell them that your God is the only God. That's not going to go well. Self-denial or taking up the cross to follow Yeshua meant social identification with Yeshua as the one who claimed to be the end-time prophet, ushering in the kingdom of God. Following Yeshua required accepting his vision for Israel and living by that vision. Dangerous and violent robbers could be crucified, often near or at the scene of their crimes. Very visual display. Deterrent. Quintilian approved of crucifixion as a penalty for such criminals and thought that this form of execution had a better deterrent effect when crosses were set up along the busiest roads. Whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen, where the most people can see and be moved by fear. Intimidation. You would have seen crosses in the first century. For penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect. This is the thing about power with Rome. This is about keeping the lower class in line. This is about keeping those who are not Romans in line. Cicero, Seneca and other Romans recognized that crucifixion was an atrociously cruel form of execution. Most took it for granted that this frequent form of execution was needed to do what? Deter the lower classes from committing serious crimes. Can you imagine if our leadership decided... I'm having a hard time not telling a joke here. Our leadership decided that we're not voting correctly, or that we didn't vote correctly, and therefore we need to be punished because we didn't put in the leader that we were supposed to put in. Well, you have no idea how hard that was for me not to tell a joke. Although crucifixion was frequent in Roman times, cultured writers preferred to say little about it. Rome had an ego too, didn't it? They wanted to look nice. They wanted to look pretty. Of course they weren't going to talk about it. Why? Because they might end up getting crucified. Josephus Tacitus, unlike Josephus, Tacitus does not mention the innumerable crucifixion in Palestine. As we saw above, the Romans frequently employed this sadistically cruel and utterly shameful death by crucifixion to uphold civil authority and preserve law and order against troublesome criminals. Now, it's really interesting, as I wanted to find more information on what they consider troublesome. Sometimes we find that our definitions aren't the same. What we think is troublesome, they might find out as disagreement, or for not bowing before the emperor as he comes by, or telling him to get his statues down, or to, get their images down. Little Josephus reference there. Slaves and rebels. In Palestine, crucifixion was a public reminder of what? Jewish servitude to a foreign power. You see where that whole choice thing comes in?
Mm-hmm.
Who do you want to be proud of you? Do you want to glorify yourself? Because that's what you get down here, is glorification of self. Or do you want to glorify God? Counting the cost of discipleship is difficult since none of us... This is beautiful. This is beautiful. We're getting close to the end. Counting the cost of discipleship is difficult since none of us come into faith has or can have any idea of the future or what sacrifices commitment to Christ will involve. Think about when the Israelites are about to get the Torah. What do they tell Moses before Moses says anything? What God has said we will do. Okay, what has God said? So far, nothing. They agreed to the whole thing without before hearing a word of it. Does that sound familiar?
Yep.
I did it. I'm sure a lot of you did it too. Nobody sat down and says, okay, Genesis, page 1 says this. Page 2 says this. And then went all the way through. And then said, okay, now after sitting through the entire Torah, let's look and see what scriptures talk about it in the Psalms and the Proverbs. Let's see what scriptures in the prophets talk about it. Now let's see how it relates from the New Testament, relates back, and how this halakha explains so you can get a better understanding. So you sat through the entire Bible and explained it to you, and then you say, are you in or are you out? Got any questions? Yeah, everything. It didn't happen, did it?
Nope.
No. Counting the cost of discipleship is difficult since none of us come into faith, has or can have any idea of the future or what sacrifices the commitment of Christ will involve. And the starting place for that is because as we're brought up, we are, for lack of a better phrase, our love is for self. We base love on how other people make us feel. Depending on how they make us feel, depends on whether we'll give that love back. We like people who treat us well. See, because everything's based on the self, on our entire concept, even with God, is why wasn't God there for me? Why didn't he do this for me? What we don't understand at that point was we were created to serve God. And that paradigm of thinking when you were first born again hasn't changed yet, has it? You're still looking at everything through yourself. Matter of fact, many of us have to learn to forgive, don't we?
Right.
Absolutely. We have to learn how to help people we don't like. Because we're focusing on self. Because remember Yeshua said, the two things that sum up the Torah, and this is in its most basic form, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul, and with all your might. Mm-hmm. Where are you in that? You're the one doing the loving.
Right.
And to love your neighbor as yourself. See, that assumes that you already love yourself.
Right.
That's a given. But you're to love that neighbor. And Yeshua says, if you understand this, you basically got the gist of the whole thing. Because this is what it's all about. But when you come to faith, that's not what you're thinking. What about me? See, because we think we've got things like love bank. And I absolutely hate that line of thinking. Well, if nobody puts anything in the love bank, you got nothing to take out. Well, you were created to love. That means it's supposed to flow out from you. God already gave you that. You're waiting for other people to put in. God put in. And he will show you and he will teach you if you allow him. But we don't understand that when we come to faith. We're not even in that type of society. They were in the first century. To say Yeshua is Lord, though, does not mean Yeshua is Lord unless, right? Mm-hmm. Faith in Christ, worth a name by necessity, means discipleship with all its consequences. You're not going to make people happy. You might not make the world happy. You're not here to make the world happy. I'm not saying they go out there and try and make the world miserable by any stretch of the imagination. But a lot of the world doesn't care for the things of God. Like I said, the world loved its darkness, and when you introduce light, that's going to scare some. It's going to aggravate some. But it's also going to help some people see where they need to go, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We are given over to another who shapes our lives. The parables are about more than considering the cost of discipleship. Presupposed and more significant is the fact that discipleship requires intent, choice, determination, and, here's one. We don't like this one much anymore. Effort. It is not some light-hearted affair, and it does not just happen. I want us to think about some words from Philippians chapter 3, 7 to 15, because this sums it up beautifully. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made comfortable unto his death, if by any means I might attain unto the resurrection of the dead, not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. Brethren, I count not myself to apprehended, But this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forth unto those things which are before, I press towards the mark for the prize of the high calling of Christ in God Jesus. Let us therefore, as many be perfect, be thus minded. And if anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Paul did not have an easy life after he came to God, did he? Paul, I still submit that people weren't too excited when they got to hear from him. There's a lot of correction going on when you look at those letters.
Yeah.
Paul went through beatings. Paul had a pretty good gig going before he came to Christ, didn't he? Trained at the feet of Gamaliel. By the world standards, he had things set pretty well. But he gave it all. He gave it all. Paul was all in, and as such, he is a wonderful, wonderful summation of everything I was trying to say. So we got some bonus stuff here, and I'm going to flip through the pages. I've got to keep talking or this thing will act up on me, so I really don't have anything worthwhile to say at this point, so just turn my voice down. Slow this down as often as you need to, and it doesn't do you any good if you're hearing me live because I'm going through this. And get what you need to, but also know that it's in a format where you can go back and rewind and get what you need. This is stuff, it would have made the teaching a lot longer. It would have made certain sections too long and hard to stay focused, but I didn't want you to be without it, so we put it in the bonus stuff. And I'm thinking pretty soon we should be at the end of it, because I'm thinking crucifixion stuff